or positive about these compounds. Whatever you believe their value to be, they continue to have profound effects wherever we find their use, whether it's contemporary Western culture or in the Amazon rainforest.
It was in the 50s that the ayahuasca churches started going public. You know, there was a kind of transition from the indigenous Indians in South America to the mestizo people in the cities, and then these churches, you know, the Santo Daime Church and then the UDV Church a little later, started doing ceremonies that would made the ayahuasca accessible not just to Indians, but to urban people in the big cities in Brazil, who are as far from the shamans as we are.
In the early 1990s, the UDV established a branch of their church in the United States. In the late 90s, the U.S. Customs Department, along with the DEA, intercepted a shipment of ayahuasca. The church protested the government action. They contended that it violated the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and the case was heard in the U.S. Supreme Court. And in February 2006, their decision was announced, and it was a unanimous decision on the side of the UDV.
Why is it that in the entire Western world, these substances that have been found to be so interesting by hundreds of cultures for thousands of years are prohibited? How did these cultures that consider themselves to be enlightened, democratic, and scientific get to declaring plants illegal? It can seem weird, but there's clearly something deep and revealing about the nature of these societies.
Our society values alert, problem-solving consciousness, and it devalues all other states of consciousness. Any kind of consciousness that is not related to the production or consumption of material goods is stigmatized in our society today. Of course, we accept drunkenness. We allow people some brief respite from the material grind. A society that subscribes to that model is a society that is going to condemn the states of consciousness that have nothing to do with the alert problem-solving mentality. And if you go back to the 1960s, when there was, a tremendous upsurge of exploration of psychedelics, I would say that the huge backlash that followed that had to do with a fear on the part of the powers that be, that if enough people went into those realms and those experiences, the very fabric of the society we have today would be picked apart, and most importantly, those in power at the top would not be in power at the top anymore.
There was an optimism that was ungrounded, that Vietnam was happening, that all this real stuff was going on, and that the psychedelic movement wasn't really addressing that in a real way, and that Timothy and that bunch sold us a false bill of goods that didn't really work.
So we are now, whether we like it or not, in the psychochemical age. In the future, it's not going to be what book you read, it's going to be what chemicals do you use to open or close your consciousness. Chemicals can help us learn faster. Chemicals can help us expand or contract our consciousness.
The atmosphere in the 1960s was, we are doing research here. We are dedicating our lives to trying just about everything on the planet. So we would try it. Then we would talk about it, then we would evaluate it. We regarded ourselves more or less as spiritual pioneers.
I mean, the way I look at the 60s, you can see it as a kind of failed attempt at a mass cultural voyage of initiation. So people would try to go out into these other realities, but they didn't have a basis for it. There weren't wisdom traditions and elders, there weren't connections of shamanic lineages, so people would go out and they would kind of smash apart.
Timothy Leary really so discredited a scientific approach to studying this, because he started off doing interesting research and then got into advocating use in a way that was incredibly threatening. Culturally, we reacted, and politically, it became impossible to do this sort of research. Funding agencies didn't make resources available. Regulatory agencies increased the practical hurdles for initiating this kind of research. And I think people who had interest in research of this type largely were discredited because of their interest in the research. Social, political, scientific issues that came together pushed these drugs out of the scientific marketplace.
The public opinion in many cases had become that psychedelic research was dangerous. The lay public was uninformed about the true nature of these compounds and what their importance may be in the understanding of perception itself.
One of the tragedies to me is that the clinical research on these substances pretty much stopped around 1970. And for me, it's especially tragic because I really believe that these substances played a major role in the development of our philosophy and thinking throughout the world. What a lot of people don't realize is that psychiatry, up until the 50s, the field in general had no concept that neurochemistry played any role in emotion or behavior, which today seems really bizarre. And the discovery of LSD and its potent effects on the human psyche occurred almost contemporaneously with the discovery of serotonin as a molecule in the brain. And it was really when people looked at the structure of serotonin and compared it with LSD that they really began to think, maybe neurochemistry plays a role in brain chemistry and behavioral states. If LSD had not been discovered, I doubt we would have had any of the drugs we have, at least not as quickly as we do for treating depression and so forth.
Once these drugs became abused and scandalized, psychiatry had to really work hard, to distance themselves from any valid scientifically meritorious relationship with psychedelics. Being a psychiatrist and saying you want to learn or study about psychedelics, it's not that well received. And I made one mention one time and was discouraged from really bringing it up again for actually a number of years.
For cultural reasons, the whole class of compounds got pulled off the clinical bench, and no research has gone on for 40 years. So scientifically, I can't imagine a more exciting area to be pursuing.
How does one go about studying these plants and compounds? Plants and compounds which produce unimaginable experiences and appear to shed light on some of humanity's greatest mysteries. In order to answer that question, Dr. Strassman conducted the first human psychedelic research in a generation.
One of the things that I had established early on was being able to discriminate between studies in the scientific realm and recreational use. But in the early 1980s, I reviewed all of that literature and could pretty well establish that if people were really carefully screened and supervised and then followed up, that the incidence of adverse reactions to LSD and related psychedelic drugs was extremely low. The drug or the compound or the chemical that seemed like the best candidate to sort of reopen the U.S. Front on psychedelic research would be DMT.
It was really, it was exciting for me because I thought this is the first study in a generation. And not only that, despite the fact that DMT had been used safely in earlier studies and it was this natural component of the brain, DMT is one of the most profound and potent psychedelics known. So it wasn't just an initiation of clinical research, it was a reinitiation of clinical research with an extremely potent drug. I was of the strong opinion that you could do these studies, and Rick agreed. So we had a number of discussions, and at some point the discussion came up, Dave, what if I do all this paperwork and spend all this time and get to the end of things and I'm ready to go and I can't get the DMT? And that was a real possibility because DMT, clinical grade DMT, wasn't a chemical you could just buy off the shelf somewhere. And I told Rick, if you get to that point and no one will make it, then I'll do it. And ultimately, Rick got to that point, and I made it.
The design of the study was fairly straightforward. give people DMT and measure as many variables as possible. I had to sort of anticipate a lot of objections that would come my way from the regulatory agencies that oversee this kind of research. So at that point began a 2-year process of dealing with not that many regulatory agencies, but fairly monolithic ones. One sort of a sidelight of the protocol was the involvement of a psychiatrist from UCLA named Daniel Friedman. He was a kind of one of the grand old men of American psychiatry, and actually he was one of the people who in the 50s and 60s got their start with psychedelic research.
And the main thing that Danny Friedman told us was, don't even get close to psychotherapy. Forget about treating mental illness or alcoholism or anything. Forget that. That's where all the hysteria is. That's where all the fears get up. You're a scientist, Rick. Approach it as a scientist. Do basic, simple measurements. Look at heart rate, cardiovascular parameters. You won't get in trouble doing that. You can get it funded, and it's solid science. Rick did what he said, but then he still was able to get these, accounts of what happened. And that wasn't in the plan. That wasn't really what was proposed in the studies that were funded, and that wasn't what Danny talked about. But those were the spin-off that really made it interesting.
Rick Strassman was advertising in some magazine somewhere about wanting volunteers for a particular study in a psychotropic, and I didn't really know I didn't know DMT from STP at that time. And I remember reading that and I'm thinking, oh my God, this is bad. I better get involved in this and make sure that somebody doesn't get hurt, and that at least there'd be some sensitivity towards what this stuff is really about.
I met Rick's research nurse at a party, and she heard me talking about that I had used peyote ceremonially, and she took me aside and said, there's something that you might be interested in. We're looking for subjects, volunteer subjects, for some unusual research.
I was a little concerned that the study participants might be a little obnoxious. Maybe that's not the right word, but people that were just seeking to do a lot of drugs, and they were very professional people. There were varying degrees as to how much hallucinogen use they had been through. It seemed like there were some people that it felt like they had made it their life mission to experience every kind of substance out there, and then other people who I think were just interested for their own personal growth and or curiosity.
Once we actually got into the preparation for the actual trips, Rick asked me about roller coasters. Do you like roller coasters? The sensation of going up really high and then slamming back down towards Earth. And I said, no, I hate them. They're horrible. And he said, not good. I just wanted to go with the experience, learn as much as I could, absorb as much as I could, and be humble to it.
The idea of legally sanctioned psychedelics was just very compelling. Plus, you're in a hospital. So should you get that uncomfortable experience that you're dying, you're with doctors in a very safe environment from that point of view.
I mean, this was really very cutting edge, very out there, it was high risk. And people knew what they were getting into, and they wanted to have the extra reassurance. And I was glad, actually, to have a crash cart in the room and a team, in the hospital to respond to any emergencies.
You're in this hospital room, and there's all the sounds and the smells and just the prior experiences of being in the hospital. All these negative things come back. So there was the whole environment to be overcome, because little did I know that it didn't matter where I was. I wasn't going to be in my body. I was going to be out in the universe, and it didn't matter where you launched from. It could be a hospital room. It could be the jungle in the Amazon. It didn't matter where you were, because you weren't going to stay there.
Set and setting is so important. It's even more important than the substance. More important than the substance. Set and setting is everything. Now, what is the set and setting when you are blindfolded? The set and setting is not what you're seeing. You're not seeing anything. The set and setting is your internal self. The things that you have learned, the capacities that you have achieved, the conditions of your own psyche and psychology, these are your set and setting.
It's the medicine combined with or interacting with the set and setting that creates an effect of safety, of trust, of comfort, and of resourcefulness that makes it possible for you to take some big leaps and receive some big gifts. And if that's not there, you just get terrified.
So I didn't really have physical fears so much that they would die or have a stroke. I did have some fears about people's mental health, especially with some of the higher doses. We gave one gentleman who had a lot of experience with the drug one dose, and he didn't think it took him far enough. So then we gave him a higher dose, and he was gone. He was really gone. It reminded me of something from The Exorcist. I mean, he just boom, sat bolt up in the bed, and his eyes opened up, and they were completely dilated and black. And I almost thought he was going to turn his head completely around. And I remember looking at Rick, and Rick looked at me, and I thought, oh my God, he's gone. I hope he comes back. And he did.
The countdown was like, counting down preparing for your death, like waiting to surrender. And you'd feel the coldness, and the coldness just going through your veins. And it's really indescribable. It's hard to, it's like ice going through your veins. And the next thing that would happen, besides my racing heart, is this burning sensation would happen on the back of my neck. I mean, this was reliable. This is like clockwork. This happened every time that you shot me up with DMT. And then there'd be a hum, and the hum would get louder and louder, and to the point where it broke apart everything that I was or knew. It was just this. It just got louder and louder until you just had to surrender to the sound. And then you were there.
I would get a warm, full feeling, a golden feeling in my chest before it went to my head. And I'd feel this warm rod, about 1.5 inches in diameter, start growing up inside my central channel. It would come up and sort of slow, warm up my chest, go up through my head, and slow down and put tremendous